Late October 2012. Sandy makes landfall in New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut.
We watched the water just rise up, come up the street, and it got higher and higher and higher. And at that point, it was about 7 o'clock, 7:15.
I was stunned at how fast it all happened.
It's at the curb. It's at the grass. It's at the front door. It's coming in the front door.
And I walked out to the curb, and I was at about chest-high water.
Despite storm surge warnings and evacuation orders issued days before landfall, 117 deaths have been attributed to Hurricane Sandy. Why didn't people leave? Why was there such a failure to communicate risk to residents? How could we do better to prevent such a catastrophe? The Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey Sea Grant programs with NOAA National Sea Grant asked social scientists why as part of the Coastal Storm Awareness Program. Their answers are drawn from 10 competitively selected research projects funded through the Disaster Relief Appropriations Act of 2013. 40 deaths were by drowning, nearly half of which occurred in flooded homes. Interviews conducted by State University of New York researchers showed that people's previous experience with Tropical Storm Irene influenced the reaction of some people to warnings about Sandy. Researchers from Hofstra University found that while only a third of Long Beach, New York coastal residents left their homes prior to Sandy, the resulting damage forced 90% of them to evacuate after the storm. The Coastal Storm Awareness Program was based on 3 framing questions. Question 1. How are storm warning reports obtained? Who is communicating them and who is listening to which sources? As expected, people used a broad spectrum of media platforms to keep updated on Sandy's storm warnings and information.
The study found that emergency briefings issued by National Weather Service can be a very effective tool for motivating residents to take action during coastal flood events. The briefings allow for forecasters to prioritize information and categorize risks and give clear, direct action statements to residents to help them in their decision-making.
Another reason for using as many different forms of communication as possible is that primary sources of information change during the storm. According to results from Mississippi State researchers, about 70% of those who changed information sources during Hurricane Sandy said they did so because they lost power. Reliance on TV decreased during the storm, while radio use and face-to-face conversations increased. 33% lost cell phone service, while 66% lost TV service. But reliance on social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter was also fairly strong and likely to continue to increase in the future. Storms generate a lot of conversation. Twitter captured nearly 14 million tweets over a 17-day period before, during, and after Sandy. These messages were analyzed by researchers who coded them by keywords related to weather. They looked at the interconnectivity of Twitter users and the influence of prominent users in the network. This includes New York City then Mayor Bloomberg, New Jersey Governor Christie, and New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, formerly mayor of Newark, as well as FEMA and NOAA. Twitter uses most frequently tweeted storm damage photos, as well as personal experiences and storm information. Using all of these communication platforms to issue consistent storm warnings increases the likelihood that people in affected areas can access critical information.
It was very difficult to find out what was really going on.
We had no cell phone service, no news footage, nothing.
It was like a war had come through overnight.
Question 2. The second framing question of these projects was, what primary factors influence decisions to follow or ignore storm warnings? How is the information processed? And who or what plays a role in subsequent action or inaction? People seemed to trust different sources of storm information as the results were mixed in terms of which sources were mentioned most frequently. People recognize the National Weather Service as the authoritative source of weather information, but expected and preferred to receive this information from more local sources. Researchers at Yale conducted a human segmentation analysis of Connecticut coastal residents that grouped people into 5 categories based on risk perception and other factors.
We also identified 5 groups based on their attitudes towards hurricanes. The first out are people who understand the risks and say they were willing to leave for a hurricane of any strength. They think it's safer to go. Next are the constrained, who understand the risks of hurricanes, but they face significant barriers to leaving if they need to, so they have health or disability issues for themselves or their family, or they have pets, or they lack transportation. Third, these folks are not expecting a hurricane of any strength in the next 50 years, so they are the least prepared of all the groups, but they say that if one did occur, that they would evacuate. And yet, if they need to evacuate, they face many barriers, even more so than the constrained. Fourth are the reluctant, who do not want to go. They feel safe at home, but they say that if they're ordered to go by a local police or a local government official, then they will leave. And they don't perceive many barriers to leaving if they need to go. And finally are the diehards, who feel safe at home. They do not intend to evacuate. They don't want to evacuate. They're confident that they can keep themselves and their family safe. And in fact, they feel that it's riskier to leave than to stay at home because they're worried about their property. They're not thinking about their own lives.
If we're going to have messages coming from traditional authority figures, it might be important for them to talk about the actions that they're taking, such as evacuating their own families or going door to door, more than just repeating over and over again that there's a mandatory evacuation.
We did this project by interviewing local emergency managers and finding out what their needs were for communicating with the public about coastal storm risk. We then did a survey testing various messages with the public to find out if certain messages were more effective at getting people to evacuate or take preparatory measures.
In contrast, researchers at Cornell, Mississippi State, and Hofstra determined that family, friends, or neighbors, local TV news, or the Weather Channel played major roles in influencing evacuation decisions more so than government agencies or officials.
In our study of Hurricane Sandy victims and what they were paying attention to prior to their decisions, we found that often people listen to their friends and family more than they might listen to traditional authority figures.
Another important factor involves the format of the warnings. The word voluntary, used in combination with evacuation orders, was determined to be completely ineffective by researchers at both Rutgers and Cornell.
We compared different types of evacuation wording, so mandatory evacuation, voluntary evacuation, and other wordings. And like many of the other groups that were funded through the CSAP program, we found that using voluntary as a descriptor of an evacuation results in very low levels of evacuation intention. So saying mandatory seems to result in the highest, but that there are some other words that can be used in between there, such as evacuation advisory or just evacuation recommendation, that seem to result in higher levels of evacuation intentions than using the word voluntary.
And we found out that having a mandatory evacuation order is the simplest way and the most effective way of communicating risk.
Yale researchers found that only 21% of coastal residents living in Evacuation Zone A and facing a Category 2 hurricane would evacuate without an official notice. About 6 in 10, 58%, said they would evacuate if an official advised them to. Evacuation orders or flood warnings for certain areas are meaningless if people don't know where they live relative to the scope of those orders of warnings. Some may leave that don't really need to, while others who clearly need to leave may not. And do people actually know where those evacuation signs lead?
And we found a couple of surprising things. First is that 74% of coastal residents have never seen an evacuation map. So if they need to get out, they don't necessarily know the best route. Also, 70% of residents either don't know or believe that they do not live in an evacuation zone. And we only included people in the survey who lived in the evacuation zone, so they do.
In 2013, New York City revised its hurricane evacuation zones and initiated a Know Your Zone campaign to help familiarize residents with these changes, with maps like the one shown. Terminology used in storm warnings plays an important role in determining whether the risk conveyed is understood by the general population. Columbia researchers found that few people had any concept of what the term storm surge meant. Some envisioned a tsunami.
Well, the simplest way to explain storm surge is the winds in a hurricane or any big storm are typically quite strong, and they're pushing on the ocean, and they push the ocean towards the land. The water hits the land, it's got nowhere to go but inland, and it floods areas which are normally dry. Well, we've gotten better at communicating the depth or height of the water, so 5 feet, 6 feet, 7 feet, and how far inland the water can go. Where we're still struggling is to convey the force of the water. A lot of people think that the water's coming up, gentle, and maybe touch their doorstep and then go back down, and it's going to be okay, you can ride it out. But the force of storm surge is actually quite strong. You have waves, actually quite large waves, riding on top of the storm surge, and the pounding and pounding and pounding the structure until the structure is either falls or collapses or is knocked off the foundation.
A third factor, previous experience with coastal storms, also had a strong influence on how people reacted to storm warnings for Sandy. Columbia researchers found that while the most important factor in a decision to evacuate during Sandy was the family's personal safety, the most important factor in a decision not to evacuate was previous experience.
The main focus there was to understand decision-making practices in terms of disaster preparedness as well as evacuation, and specifically the role of the adolescent in times of disaster and decision-making. And what we found is that depending on the family structure, single-parent families, for example, included the adolescent's voice more in the decision-making and disaster preparedness.
Based on Cornell research, previous experience also hinders or colors a person's ability to conceptualize just how bad a storm can be. People can only imagine the worst storm they have ever experienced.
Second thing that I would like people to remember is nothing about us without us. It's a slogan in the disability rights community, and it reinforces the idea that there is no difference between disability rights and civil rights. We all have the right to live, we all have the right to be evacuated and have one and all value our existence.
One of the most typical answers we heard was that they had nowhere else to go. We also spoke to many people who weren't able to get good information, who didn't find it accessible, or who were simply afraid of what would happen if they left their home place or if they took refuge in a shelter.
People are also reluctant to leave their pets behind, and more communities are beginning to address the need for pet-friendly shelters. FEMA, states, and communities are working to require homes in vulnerable coastal areas to be flood compliant. One interesting question that arose from the studies conducted by Cornell, Yale, and Hofstra is, what effect will FEMA, state, and local requirements that homes in vulnerable coastal areas be flood compliant have on future evacuation behavior?
One of the more interesting preliminary findings coming out of our research has to do with possibly the conflict between the evacuation information that we're trying to get to people and their perception of the safety of their houses. And this would relate, for example, to all of the efforts to raise houses to make them more storm compliant. And so what we're learning is that if we ask people on a survey, they seem to say that if their house is safe, they'll evacuate. But we also learned in the focus groups exactly the opposite, that people that said that their houses were safe, or they felt that they were safer, were less likely to evacuate because they felt safe in their house.
Most individuals see that the risk of high-impact storm events is increasing. They see the consequences as dire. However, they still express a strong commitment to staying in that community. One heartening finding is that a lot of people feel individually responsible for preparing for those risks. However, they don't have a great idea of how to prepare for long-term risks.
The last framing question focused on improvements to future warnings to make them more actionable and effective. How can the content or delivery of future warnings be improved to increase understanding and compliance? Nurture Nature Center researchers developed some recommendations for improving the verbal and graphic clarity of these materials. Keep the briefings short and include clear, direct summaries. Deliver the most critical action-oriented information up front. Move storm details more to the back. Use color, different font sizes, bolding and underlining to emphasize important information. They also determined that emergency managers and local officials start paying close attention to the warnings 6 to 7 days out, and residents 4 to 5 days out. The research team also looked at a number of graphics generated by the National Weather Service, including this wind speed direction map. Their suggested revisions to improve readability and to make it more understandable to more audience include adding a more detailed legend that explains the wind barbs and flags, calling out key community names in white, and enlarging the font size for wind speeds in miles per hour.
Sometimes they put collars on a stop sign that say, this is, you're in a storage zone, or this is how high the water could go. I think we need to continue to reinforce those visual representations of how far inland the water can go and how high it can get.
Researchers at Hofstra worked with some of the Latino community in Long Beach, New York, and ultimately new messages issued from that city will be in several languages.
Long Beach Latino Civic Association understood that information was getting out to the community in English only, and we recognized the fact that this was something that had to change, especially due to the fact that we have hurricane announcements, and it was necessary for those who do not speak English to also know what was happening. We persuaded and helped and worked with the City Council to thereby enact legislation around language access.
We are trying to create a web application that allows for bi-directional communication between emergency managers of weather-related emergencies and the general public. Our goal is to be able to capture the images that are shared by people via Twitter and Instagram and serve those images up to emergency managers who can then dispatch those images for the correct response during a weather-related emergency.
Our Coastal Storm Awareness Program, CSAP, explored the human dimensions of the coastal storm preparedness, planning, and response issue. This is an issue that people in the greater New York metropolitan area have had to deal with for a long time. Sandy has brought it to the forefront, and the purpose of this research program was to develop better understandings about certain questions that dictate how effectively coastal storm warnings affect and produce the kind of good decisions on the part of citizens in the path of the storm that we would like to see. So we worked with the New Jersey and Connecticut Sea Grant programs, the National Sea Grant Office, and professionals in the weather community, weather forecasting community, and the emergency response community to answer or to address three major questions. The first being, how do people these days get their information about coastal storms and warnings about coastal storms? Secondly, with this information in hand, what decision factors do they use? What is in their minds when they decide to heed a warning or not? And we now know that those factors vary between communities because of cultural, economic, social, and ethnic differences between communities. And then thirdly, and building on those first two, how can we make storm warnings in the future better, produce more actionable information, give people a better sense of what the storm is really going to be like, and what threats it would really pose to them when it finally arrives. CSAP has been a successful research program. We've produced lots of good information. That information is now being put in the hands of these emergency management and weather forecasting professionals to hopefully improve their ability to get the word out in timely and effective fashion in advance of the next coastal storm. These storms will not go away. They are likely to increase and become perhaps even more severe on average with global warming. So, CSAP has not written the final chapter in this important issue. We have made a beginning. Perhaps we've sketched out the table of contents for that book. Our fundamental purpose is to do research and to put the research results that we get in the hands of people who need it so that they are better able to predict the answer to the question which coastal residents in this region will inevitably face. And that question is, what are you going to do when the warning comes?
What you gonna do when the warning comes? Are you gonna go? Do you have a plan? Who you gonna listen to? What you gonna do when the warming comes? Where you gonna go? What you gonna take? Who you gonna leave behind? Prepare to stay safely, but leave if you have to. Live in a flood zone, do you know? A safe route from home. If storm surge is extreme, do you know what that means? Will someone you love be swept away? What you gonna do when the warning comes? Are you gonna go? Do you have a plan? Who you gonna listen to? What you gonna do when the morning comes? Take a look around, hope that you have found everyone is safe and sound. Safe and sound. Nothing about us without us. Ask yourself, what you gonna do? What you gonna do? What you gonna do? What you gonna do? It's up to you.